Hello and welcome to the Scotch Tracker. Today we have as guests David Mack, writer of numerous Star Trek novels, and Scott Tipton, writer of numerous Star Trek comics. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you also to the co-hosts. We have 4 co-hosts with us joining. One question I had was, how does writing comics and writing novels differ, would you say?
David, I think you've done a little of both, haven't you?
I have. I've done work for comic books, both for Star Trek and for Farscape, and I've written 36 novels. They are night and day, really, in terms of both the length of the manuscripts, the word count, the format. It's all completely different. When you're writing a novel, you're speaking to all 5 senses. You're writing integrated prose. You're typically crafting a single story that will span about 100,000 words is the average at most publishers for a novel. A comic book script, there is no one industry standard for format, for length, for style. It's whatever enables the writer to communicate the story effectively to the artist so that the artist can interpret it onto the page. But mostly all you put into a script for comic books, mostly, the same way you would for, say, film or TV, is what you can see and the sound effects that you want represented on the page, as opposed to the sounds you would hear in film or TV. So the 2 formats are very different in terms of what you can put in, how you lay out the information. You're describing usually a series of sequential images. So you have to remember to think not in terms of continual motion, but in terms of describing a series of images that imply the motion occurring between them so that the reader can infer it.
Yeah, that is what I found whenever I've had people asking me about wanting to write comics, and they'll show me their first efforts. And even people who have written a lot of screenplays come into it thinking, oh, I've got this. And no, it's a different format. And so I'll look at their script, and it's like, Batman crosses the room, opens a window, fires his batarang, and leaps out. And I'm like, dude, that's 5 panels.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that. So that's kind of the biggest, I think, hurdle that new comics writers have. And the other thing is that, unlike a novel writing, which I'm sure is very solitary, even though you'll have notes and editors, everything about comics is a collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're lucky, you have a great collaborator that you know and you trust, and you can actually, give them a lot more leeway and freedom to interpret what you want. But if you don't know who your artist is, you've got to be very specific about what you want in the panel and where it's going, because if everything that you don't mention is going to be up to them to then kind of interpret or add to. Mm-hmm. And that can be a good thing within the hands of a great artist, and that can be scary otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because you count on the illustration to further, because you only have so much room to write.
Oh, yeah.
So that illustration has to convey.
Yeah.
Unlike a novel where you're encouraged to spend 1,000 words, describing the dust mote on the windowsill, in comic books, you are encouraged to use as few printed words on the page as possible. Mm-hmm. Just enough to get the dialogue through, just enough maybe to get interior monologue into a caption box. But you don't want the text to overcrowd the art. You want to give the artist room to breathe, room to work. The more text and the more panels you try to cram onto a single page, the more your artist is going to hate you, because they have to make the panels smaller. They've got to do more in less space. If you give them breathing room, then they can often impress you by finding ways to lay out the material that you didn't think of.
Unless you're working with someone like a George Perez or someone who's really good at that kind of micro paneling. Mm-hmm. I always try and give them as much room as possible on the panel. Also, because your page layouts and your panels, that's also what kind of dictates your pacing for the reader.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's as much kind of strategy to it to get across the kind of motion and vitality that you would get in film or TV.
Yeah, and knowing when to plan your splash pages.
Right. Big time.
And for our viewers, what is a splash page?
It's when the art takes up an entire page with a single image, usually with a fair degree of complexity, but not always. Mm-hmm. The writers love them because, it's one full page of your script and you only have to describe one panel. and I guess I don't know how artists feel about them. I guess drawing a whole page is just as hard as drawing a whole bunch of panels. But
no, but my artists tend to like them because they can then sell them for more on the aftermarket.
Right.
A nice pretty splash page is going to get them more money than 6 pages of Picard talking heads.
that's a good point.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
If you read
Everybody's happy.
if you read
Right.
comics in the 60s and 70s, basically every Marvel and DC comic opened with a big splash page.
Right. With a ton of text, particularly if it was a Stan Lee or
Well, that's usually where you dump your credits.
Yeah, exactly. And when it was Jolt and Joe and Stan the Man and what have you. So I'm a Marvel zombie going way back. I mean, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, thus my outfit, was the first real big Star Trek splash in Marvel, and they left and they came back in the '90s, and I really enjoyed those. But Scott, when did you get rolling with Star Trek comics? Just refresh my memory, because I know I've been reading your stuff for a long time.
Not long after IDW acquired the license, I was writing Angel and Spike for them at the time.
Gotcha.
And then the word came down that they had the Star Trek license, and I called up the editor-in-chief at the time, Chris Ryle, and I'm like, "Look, man, I'm not saying give me Star Trek. I know you can't. Open the door a little. Let me pitch.
Yeah.
If I can just get my foot in the door, I can sell something. This is what I've been waiting for." And so he let me pitch, and one of the first thing we did was Klingon's Blood Will Tell.
Right. Good book.
Yeah. And I just came in and pitched them on Klingon Rashomon, where we look at all the Kirk episodes of classic Trek from the Klingon side.
Right, and it was scripted in Klingon, wasn't it?
The first issue was entirely in Klingon, thanks to the at the Klingon Language Institute.
Right, gotcha.
Right. So, Scott, on that, I read last night your the mirror episode, that the mirror comic that you did. Can you talk a little bit about that, the mirror images? Because I really enjoy having the alternate universe, having Picard and Kirk. Yeah, I enjoyed that. I really did enjoy reading that.
Thanks. Well, actually, I did it twice. Initially, the first book we did was with David Messina, and that one was mostly about how Mirror Kirk rose to power.
Right.
And we put in like a Picard interlude. But most recently, I've been doing a series all about Mirror and Next Generation, which I've never been done. And that came right from CBS. CBS was working with J.K. Woodward, my longtime collaborator, on creating a style guide for the Next Gen Mirror universe, since they had never been one. And so they came to us with all the kind of concepts of the characters' looks and said, okay, here's what Mirror Next Gen characters look like. What do you think the story is? And so that's when David and I said, "Oh, fantastic!"
Right.
Oh, how did you rationalize the fact that there is no? How did you rationalize that around the DS9 canon that established that the Terran Empire fell after Spock's reforms?
This came right from CBS too. Is that a lot of that, and then we kind of established it in the books. A lot of that is propaganda from the Klingon-Cardassian Alliance, who want way out there at the DS9 area of space. They don't want people knowing that there's some pockets of the Terran Empire still thriving and getting by there. And then our story has been Picard trying to push those boundaries out and get the Empire back out into a place where it can go up against the Cardassian Klingon Alliance.
Well, I would say don't spoil it, because I know that a lot of those books are available on Comixology Unlimited. So I know I'm into maybe the second volume, so don't spoil it.
No worries.
But you touch on something interesting when you said CBS came to you. And again, I do a couple of different podcasts, one of which is a weekly podcast about Star Trek. But I do another one about Star Wars, which is just focused on canon stories on a month-by-month basis. I do that once a month. But I'm kind of a canon guy. I love canon stories. So I guess my question is a long way around. If CBS kind of stepped to you to talk about those elements, like here's pictures, what do you think of this? Does that kind of lead us down the path that your stories might be considered canon within the universe? No? Okay.
That's not how it works in Star Trek.
Here's the way
I didn't think so.
Here's the way I look at it, though. All I care about is if a story touches me.
Is it a good story? Yeah, that's all that really matters.
If the story works for me, then I believe it, and it happened, and in my mind, it's canon. And that's all I really care about as a reader. You know?
Right. And
Okay,
I have to say, like, when I read your comic last night, like, it did captivate me. I find it interesting about Kirk and Picard. I really did enjoy it.
Well, one of the things David and I have always done with our Star Trek, because you always hear people say, "Oh, with comics, the beautiful thing is an unlimited special effects budget, and you can do anything you want."
Mhm.
Well, maybe you can. That doesn't mean you should. We always try and every script that we write should be able to be filmable. If they can take it and make an episode out of it, then to us, we're doing our job. Because it needs to feel like the show that readers love and viewers love.
And a question to both of you, because both of you done the alternate universe Trek. Like, is that like more freeing to like kind of have that open, like you're taking a beloved character and you're writing them like totally different in this alternate universe? Is that like kind of freeing as a writer? Does that give you more freedom, or is it?
Yeah, it's just a different kind of challenge. You have to find what's true about that version of the character, either based on what's been established on screen or what you could logically extrapolate. In the books, we took a very different approach to the mirror universe than Scott and David did in the comics. And we basically adhered strictly to what the DS9 canon said. We assumed that what we were given was factual information. So, for instance, I wrote an entire novel called The Sorrows of Empire, which details the rise and fall of Emperor Spock, how he comes to power. And it turns out, not to spoil it, but there's a grand plan. And then we follow that up with a few more novels, Rise Like Lions, the Terran rebellion that we saw in DS9 becomes a revolution. And it leads to the fact that because of interference from our canon characters in the Prime universe, that they're starting to shape events, that the fates of the two universes are intertwined. And as a result, democracy, the democratic galactic commonwealth takes root because of this long-term plan by Spock. So we've gone in very different directions, but both are equally plausible, I think.
Right.
And it's just a matter of interpretation. And if you go by, what we've seen, for instance, in the TNG episode Parallels, there's at least 286,000 variants on the Star Trek universe that it could be considered within the bounds of canon. So I just assume that we're working in various parallels.
Right. I love that. With Riker with the beard. I don't want to go there.
The Borg, basically the Borg hobo universe is kind of with the big beard. Yes, that's what you're thinking of. Yeah.
The one thing I will say to that though is one thing that we did really enjoy is that it was after having been writing Trek for so long, to be able to write a Star Trek that wasn't kind of like held in by Gene Roddenberry's utopianism was kind of a little bit more, because all of a sudden you can have people with the wrong motivations be your lead characters. And you have people being motivated by greed and by avarice and by jealousy, which you can do it with like some of the alien characters, but you shouldn't do that with the classic characters or the next generation, because that's not what Roddenberry wanted. But now I can. So now I can have a scheming Picard and a jealous, bitter Riker, and not feel like you're doing Roddenberry wrong.
Right. And of course, in the novels, we have had that sort of freedom because we've created a lot of secondary characters. We expanded beyond the finales of certain shows like DS9, TNG, Voyager. So with these post-finale stories, which we've been doing for about 20 years, we are able to sort of explore things that, say, the shows wouldn't have. Storylines like, exposing and destroying Section 31, that sort of thing. It's the sort of thing you can get away with in the books as long as you're not contradicted by canon. But now, of course, Picard is out, so we're having to make some adjustments on that side with our long-running literary continuity.
I was going to ask about that. Like now with Picard and changes that we've seen and speculation of things that occurred in that gap between Nemesis and now, how are you finding that to approach? It actually could be inspiring because you could try and fill in some of those gaps.
Unfortunately,
but you're not allowed to touch them, right?
It's not even that. It's just simply that what we've established over the last 20 years is an extremely complex, interconnected literary continuity where it's serialized continuity from book to book, series to series. We had linked all of our 24th century stuff, and we even connected it to some of our original 23rd century stuff, like the Star Trek Vanguard series I co-created. And so we've got this very complex mesh of shared continuity, and Picard just doesn't fit with it at all. So now we are, in a very difficult position of, one of the rules is that when you create a media tie-in property, like a novel or a comic or a game, you have to try and be consistent with canon as it exists at the time you're creating. But you always run the risk that future canon, future movies, future episodes may contradict some of the assumptions you made. And then, that element of your story falls out of synchronicity with canon. So what we are looking at now, and we're sort of approaching this, we're saying, well, when this happened to, say, Star Wars, when the new movies were coming and they realized that they'd had these long-running serialized narratives in the books, many of which were no longer going to be compatible with where the filmmakers were going, they established Star Trek Legends. They simply sort of stopped doing those stories. They put a new branding on them to separate them from the new canon continuity. And then they kind of soft rebooted the books into the new continuity. Some fans liked it, some fans didn't, especially from the standpoint of there were ongoing storylines that now just never get resolved. We don't want to do that in the Trek books. We want to resolve our long-running storylines, and that's where the Star Trek Coda trilogy is coming from. That's something that I've been developing with Dayton Ward and James Swallow. We've been working on it for almost 2 years at this point, and that'll be out at the end of this year. So people will get to see how we approach the issue in Star Trek, and whether we succeed or fail will be up to the readers.
And I have zero follow-up questions to what you just said, because that's what I was told to say. I'm just kidding. No, that sounds fascinating. No, I look forward to it. I do, David. I do actually have one of your books in my audio queue. I have the one of the Discovery novels that I've got to get to. So I've become much more of an audiobook listener, just because for work I'm an outside sales. I travel all over the mitten for work. So
Yes.
I'm in the car. That's how I get to. That's how I get to input that. So, what is kind of your overall feeling about audiobooks versus the written page as far as consumption? Where do you stand personally, and how do you feel it affects someone's experience of your work?
Well, I'm not really a fan of audiobooks myself. I still am old-fashioned. I like to read off the printed page. But I understand that for people who want to enjoy stories while they're doing something else, whether it's driving, commuting in some way, that it's a very useful thing. As far as how it affects a person's experience of my work, well, that's up to the reader. It's going to affect everybody differently. The one thing I've noticed, how it has affected how I approach my work, if you look at the books I was writing before audiobooks became a big thing at Trek, I never really worried much about like what they call dialogue tags. He said, she said, no, Spock said. In prose, when you're not worried about somebody reading it out loud, that's fine. We were always taught that the word said as a dialogue marker becomes invisible to the reader. They just scan over it. The problem is that when you do an audiobook, the narrator who has been hired to read your text can't scan over it. So they have to read the line of dialogue and then add Spock said. And I found that for some readers, they found that jarring when listening to the audiobooks. Like, I know he just said it, I just heard it. So what this has led to for me and for many other writers, and a lot of us have talked about this in different forums, is we are starting to abandon dialogue markers altogether. And instead, what we're doing is we are prefacing or following dialogue with action descriptions, short sentences of action that identify the character to whom the dialogue could then be attributed. Okay. So it would be, Spock picked up the object. This looks like, something I saw on whatever. And then, you close the dialogue and it's Spock put the thing down. And then you can add some more dialogue. But you do this to avoid the redundancy of said in an audiobook format.
Awesome. Gotcha.
Yeah, this question is for David. So, I saw that you also wrote some episodes for Deep Space Nine. Was that writing process a little bit different for writing for an episode, say for a book or for a
Completely.
comic?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
First of all, writing for TV is collaborative.
Right.
You're a writer's room. So it starts with me and my writing partner at the time, a guy named John Ordover, who used to be an editor at the Star Trek books. We put together a bunch of story pitches. He arranged for a phone pitch to the DS9 producers, since we were based in New York and they were in LA. And because he was editing the Star Trek books, we could do that. We pitch a bunch of stories over the phone. They say, we like this one, we like that one, we're going to buy those. So we sent out an audition script, I guess because we had also sold to Voyager around the time. We sold a story that ended up not being produced. So we sent Jerry Taylor our audition script, saying, look, we could do the script. Here's a sample of our work. She liked it so much that when she heard we had sold to DS9, she walked our DS9 spec script down to Ira Stephen Bear. Mm-hmm. And technically, even though he wasn't supposed to read it, she recommended it, so he read it. And he liked it enough that we got the script assignment on our first ever TV sale as freelance writers, which almost never happens.
Right.
So we went out for the break session. And a break session is where you and the other writers, basically the entire writing staff, you sit in a room and there's an assistant with a whiteboard, and you basically hash out the story by talking to each other and arguing, well, this scene could go here. We need a scene about this. We need a subplot about this. All right, where do we structure the act breaks? What's our hard out here? What's our cliffhanger on Act 2? And so you break it all down scene by scene. Sometimes it takes a day, sometimes it takes a couple of days. And at the end of the meeting, the writer's assistant types it all up and distributes it. And then you have 2 weeks to write your draft. Mm-hmm. And then you turn in the draft, and I'll never forget these words. John and I turn in our script draft, and supervising producer Hans Beimler said, "Oh, great, the script is here. Now the writing can begin." Oh, you feel like your guts have been pulled out. But he wasn't kidding. The script went through 5 more drafts in-house at the hands of Renee Echevarria before it got on screen, and it changed substantially. So writing for TV is, again, it's completely different because you're working by committee. You are working to please the showrunner's vision of their show. You're trying to capture the character voices. You're on a much stricter deadline. Mm-hmm. You're dealing with TV format. You have to learn the format particular to the show because different shows do little things differently. It's a format thing. It's a schedule thing. And it's also a teamwork thing. Mm.
Okay, so we've got a question from Johnny Q. Unfortunately, he was he left this conversation. I'm not sure if you guys are getting audio problems, but there seems to be some sort of echo going on for me. But he's I haven't been able to add him back into the chat. Unfortunately, there's a problem going on with StreamYard, but fortunately he's posted some questions on Facebook for both of you, like this one.
Why don't we just throw something to Scott, because I've been talking for a little while here, and
no worries, David. Please talk about this from here since it's on screen already.
All right, I'll try to be quick here. All right, so Star Trek Destiny is among my favorite Star Trek stories. You see about Erica Hernandez. Did I choose her because I felt she was a fan favorite, or was it my goal to elevate an already amazing character? There were a lot of things that led to Erica Hernandez becoming the pivotal character of Star Trek Destiny. It was partly the fact that the entire Destiny trilogy sprang from a single piece of art, which was an image of the NX-02 Columbia crashed in the desert. I believe it was by an artist named Pierre Drolet. Mm-hmm. It was from the Ships of the Line coffee table book.
Love them.
And the editors showed me this image, which had generated a lot of fan interest. Why was the Columbia found in the Gamma Quadrant? Why was it lost for 200 years? They thought there was some big mystery that the editors weren't telling them. So my editor said, starting from this, can you tell an epic sweeping trilogy, size Star Trek story? Not being a fool, I said, of course I can. I had no idea what I was doing. But I said, of course, because I wanted the contract for a trilogy. And they hired me and then began months and months of plotting the story. But because it all started with NX-02, Columbia in the desert, the Columbia crew, and in particular Captain Hernandez, was basically where it all started. And as a result, she just became more and more integral to the whole story, to the point where she's the actual hero of the story. She is the Christ analog in the whole thing. It's a deliverance tale, and basically she plays the role of the savior.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that trilogy very, very much. I think I read it 1.5 times, started and didn't finish, and then got the omnibus and then finished it. So absolutely loved it.
Well, thank you. Very kind.
And Johnny has a question for Scott. You want to put that one up, Dan?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No problem.
You're not Harlan City on the Edge. I get this question a lot about which version is better, Harlan's original or the one that was actually produced and broadcast. Just as a side note before I answer his next question, if you ask me on any given day, I'll give you a different answer, which I like better. I think both have such strong points to them, and I grew up watching and loving the televised one, but I think Harlan's original is a better story. It's just not a better story for an ongoing series. And, there's a lot of things in that. He wrote that basically before the show had really been broadcast and then didn't turn it in until the end of the season. So he was kind of working based on the writer's Bible. So some things are out of character based on what the show became. And so there are nuances to it you can't really judge. But for me, it's half and half. The question was, how did that come about? And that is kind of the amazing story, is that historically Harlan had such an acrimony with Paramount and then later CBS that the idea of that ever happening seemed absolutely impossible. And I'll give you the only reason that happened was Chris Ryle. Chris Ryle, editor-in-chief at IDW, had gotten to know Harlan. They'd gotten very close. Harlan trusted Chris, and Chris was able to kind of bring Harlan to the table. And because Chris has such a good relationship with CBS and John Van Sitters over at CBS, bring John to the table and get them just talking to the point where they just the idea of having something produced seemed like a possible idea that everyone could live with. And then the question became, who do you get to do it? And that was another just bit of lucky circumstance. He already knew J.K. Woodward because Woodward had done a book called Fallen Angel that Harlan loved. He loved Woodward's painted style. And then it happened that Harlan knew me because at the time I owned a comic book shop in North Hollywood, and I had sold a good-sized chunk of Harlan's legendary comic collection. So he knew me just as somebody, all right, this is somebody I've talked to. Yeah, I don't think he'd ever read any of my work, but he knew me as someone, all right, this is someone I can deal with. And then when they said, all right, how about Tipton and Woodward? And Harlan was like, yeah, all right, we'll try that. And so that it was just kind of pure luck that all those pieces aligned in a way to make that book happen. And it's still one of my most favorite things I've ever done, just because I got to work with Harlan on it. And there's nothing more nerve-wracking than sending a script that Harlan wrote back to him for his approval after you had to readapt it.
Nerve-wracking, I'm sure.
David and I,
my gosh. Yeah.
We finished it, and we sent it off, and it was Thanksgiving. As I said, I live here in Los Angeles. I go up to my father's house in the San Francisco Bay Area for Thanksgiving. It's Thanksgiving night, I'm home, and my father's landline rings. Not my cell phone, my dad's old-fashioned phone. I pick it up. Dad, it's Harlan. Huh?
How did you find me? Oh my goodness!
Like, yeah, you wrote one hell of a
I've been tracking you with a satellite.
Yeah, exactly.
What a hell of a script, kid. Thanks, Harlan. How did you get this number? Kid, I'm everywhere.
Oh boy, he is the guardian of forever. Watch out.
Yeah.
But that whole experience was fantastic.
I will, Scott, if I might. I did mention that I run a weekly Star Trek podcast. We talk about episodes and we talk about movies, but we're also doing a monthly feature on comics, and that is one that I have slated for the next several months. I've not read it before, but I'll reach out to you after the fact. I'd love to just kind of tip you off, and once we talk about it, hopefully you'll like what we have to say. I mean,
I could talk about that book and Harlan for hours.
Yes, I will be in touch. I will be in touch through Facebook if you're so inclined.
Of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Good. Thank you.
Yeah. And Jonathan has a question for both.
Yeah.
There you go.
Let's start with David. I think he has a bit more experience with this than I do.
Yeah. Speaking of someone who was pitching to both DS9 and Voyager for multiple seasons, it is always more difficult to try and craft stories when the shows are in production. because they are running the risk at any moment that a single line of dialogue that you're not aware of is coming up 3 episodes down the road that will completely blow out of the water your entire story idea, because now you're in complete contradiction of their backstory. Basically, trying to pitch stories to a show while it's running is like trying to build a custom modification to an engine while it's running. You're getting your hands in there, but the pieces keep moving and they're not going to wait for you. So it's very hard to write novels that are set within the bounds of, say, a season's continuity while it's happening, unless they follow sort of a nice episodic format that leaves some gaps that you can exploit and say, drop a story in here, drop a story in there. One of the hardest things, for instance, about trying to write the Discovery novels is that the first few all had to be prequels. Because season 1 left no gaps. There was nowhere to drop a season 1 story into the season 1 continuity as a tie-in, because they didn't leave us anywhere to do it. So, and also, when I was first hired to write the first Discovery novel, I was brought in by Brian Fuller, sort of given my marching orders by Brian. It was made clear what kind of book he wanted, which was a Burnham and Spock story, because at the time he believed Spock was never going to appear in Discovery. He was simply going to be someone referenced but never seen. So I was allowed to do all this stuff in the first book, and then Brian Fuller leaves the show. Aaron Gretchenberg and Aaron Harberts take over the show. They have completely different creative assumptions about where they want to go and what they want to do. And in season 2, they bring in Spock and Pike, and they completely blow my book out of the water. So it's very hard to find a place to drop in a story, especially now with serialized storytelling on television. Back when it was episodic, you could still get lucky. You could say, well, I can drop it into the first half of the season, and those events are established. Hopefully, if you avoid establishing anything like, a character, an important element of a character's history, don't invent any relatives, do a nice self-contained Planet of the Week, Problem of the Week story, you could get away with it back then. These days, it's almost impossible.
Oh, wow.
On the comic side, the way it has evolved over the years is that David and I tend to write most of the classic stuff, and then Mike Johnson, who's a great writer, has been doing all of the movie era, the current new movie Star Trek, which is a whole separate line, and they did a great job, but they wrote it for years and years. But he's the one that's had to deal with all the difficulties of what I'm doing is going to interrupt with the next movie or what they got planned. So on Star Trek, I haven't had much of a difficulty at all. Like David said, I've been doing the thing where we're set this episode, latter half of season 2 of Classic, and then we know, okay, this means Chekhov is in, but we can't use this guy, or has he left the series? Right. The one place I did find that was on Doctor Who. I was writing my book Prisoners of Time, which was the 50th anniversary series, so I got to use all the Doctors. Mm-hmm. And the BBC had been.
I read that; it was great.
Oh, thanks. Well, they've been super easy to work with. Every Doctor I ever used, I could use whatever characters and companions I wanted. And all of a sudden, we got to the 7th Doctor, and we just got this flat no. I wanted to use Zygons. They didn't say why. They just no Zygons. Oh, all right, I'll make them Autons. So we just switched it, and then the 50th anniversary TV special comes on, and there's a big fat Zygon. That's why I couldn't use it. Because a lot of times I don't tell you why. It's just no, you can't do it. Things have to be flexible, and luckily with both Star Trek and Doctor Who, there's so much stuff out there you can pluck out to replace an element if you need to.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered, would you say there are particular characters that are your favorites to write for?
I mean, I enjoy them all, but I guess if one were to look at my body of work, it would become very clear very quickly that I seem to have an affinity for writing for Dr. Bashir. I just seem to get this guy.
Mm-hmm.
I would say Picard is probably the easiest for me, and I can hear his voice very easily. But the ones that I always like are the ones that come with a surprise. In the most recent Mirror Universe trilogy, we brought in Barclay just kind of as like an afterthought in our very first issue, thinking,
Barclay!
We'll make Barclay a badass. And then, isn't that funny? And then as we started using him, all of a sudden, Mirror Barclay was so much fun to write, and we kind of put him into a similar relationship with Data, where they became like the kind of friends that Data and Geordi were, even though they had every reason to hate each other. And before we knew it, like Barkley was in the entire series and in the next two.
Right.
So sometimes they could come along and catch your eye, and you don't realize how much you like writing.
It was a runaway success.
Yeah, I read one of the because I remember seeing Barkley in in the alternate universe, and just to see him like all like ripped up, like bulging butts.
Right.
I'm like, yeah. that gave me a laugh.
Well, like in our third series, we have Mirror Barkley, secretly in the Prime universe, and no one knows it. He's replaced the real Barkley. Yeah. And so over the course of the series, we have him rolling up his sleeves to show off more of his guns. And he's doing it subtly every issue. So as he's getting more confident, all of a sudden, everyone likes Barkley and they want him on their teams.
Right.
And
it's a great dynamic to play with.
He would have
I think that's one thing that's fun with the comics. Talking about the comic piece, fun about the alternate universe in the comics, because you get to draw these characters in totally different ways. Like Barkley being beefed up, like the ladies, they get a little bit more sexed up and everything, and it's just interesting just to see like you view these characters in such a certain way, and then you do the alternate universe, and it's just interesting how the artists.
Yeah, and Woodward, J.K. Woodward did an amazing job designing all those brand new next gen.
Yeah,
it made our job so much easier because we saw the image and okay, I can write about that guy forever.
Yeah. So does sometimes Scott the artwork kind of influence the writing, or like
definitely
goes back and forth?
Especially if you're lucky enough to have somebody as talented as the artists we've gotten over the years, and that you know well enough that you know what their strengths are.
Oh, okay, cool.
So I mean, I'll give one artist stuff to do that I would never give another artist because I know he hates it. I'm not going to give J.K. A battle full of Cardassian spaceships because he hates Cardassian spaceships. All I hear about is complaining about. So all right, you're away from that. Whereas somebody else is like, not that excited about doing action scenes, but they can do the emotional stuff. They can do the acting. So I'll try and give them a lot more dramatic stuff. Mm-hmm. That kind of the collaboration is a big part of why I like writing comics so much.
Awesome.
Excellent.
So how important do you find having a good vocabulary is to write in Star Trek novels and comics?
It's not. I mean, I don't know if it's not vocabulary as much as it is just being immersed in that universe. It's the unique Star Trek vocabulary that's more important. Is just knowing the language of that world.
Knowing the difference between an EPS conduit and a warp coil.
Exactly.
Too big a vocabulary I found is both a blessing and a curse. It's interesting in the reviews for like a given book, I will have one reader on Amazon criticize me saying, "Oh, this book was amateurishly written. It reads like it was written by somebody in the 8th grade." And then somebody else says, "This author uses so many words I don't understand that I've never seen before." Say, well, which is it? Am I too literary or not literary enough? So,
David,
I had to tell somebody one time, it's not my fault you don't know what the word amaranthine means.
And also, to go off of something that David said before, when I go back and look at my early books, all I see is how much I was overwriting and how much of the scene is beautiful artwork I was covering up with balloons. And so as we've gotten, I'd like to think we've gotten better at this over the last 10 or 11 years. It's much more. It's like less is more. What can we do with a line or two, and then trust your artist to sell it with the emotion in the face, rather than giving a gigantic info dump in a huge balloon.
Yeah, I've had to learn sometimes that fewer words is better. That sometimes trying too hard on the page to craft the beautiful sentence winds up with this purple prose that just is so overdone that it takes you out of the moment. Sometimes it's better to have a simple statement on the page than to try and overdo it in the name of, literary merit.
Mm-hmm. And Jonathan has a question for Scott. If you can bring that up, Dan.
Yep.
That's the artwork behind me. The piece in the middle is a piece. It's just a sketch of Zatanna, the DC character, that was given to me by one of my artists, Elena Casagrande, who's currently just doing great work on Black Widow for Marvel. But she knows Zatanna is one of my favorite DC characters, so she did that for me.
Totally.
The piece on this side is a page from the Harlan Ellison City on the Edge project, where he painted me in as a space pirate.
Oh, how funny!
I'm the
I love it.
guy I've done. And then the Kermit and Yoda piece is it's called Easy Being Green. It is not. It's done by Peter DeSev, who was one of the Pixar artists. And this piece hung in the kids section of my bookstore when we had it before I sold it.
Oh, wow.
And so it was the only thing in the store that was not for sale. And my former partner and I, Judd, we each get it for half a year. So
Oh, boy.
about 2 more months, I got to send him down to San Diego, and he gets it for half the year.
Custody.
I just watched the Muppet episode with the song "It's Easy Being Green." It's
I did too. I watched it last night.
Yeah, I watched it like a couple nights ago. So I'm working my way through the series on Disney Plus.
Oh, nice. Cool. Good deal.
Hey, Scott, I have a question for you. How long does it take, like for the graphic novels, how long does that take from like beginning to end to complete?
For like a whole book worth?
Yeah, a whole book worth.
I mean, generally it's about 6 to 8 months.
Oh, okay.
Because,
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, my brother and I have gotten it down to a science where we can crank out a script pretty fast. But the best of artists can't do much more than like a full issue, which is 20 pages, in 4 or 5 weeks. Amazingly, J.K. can paint a whole issue in 6 weeks. Because every one of his pages is fully painted. I don't know how he does it. But so you do that, and he times 5 or 6 chapters. It's usually about a 6-month process, and that's not counting the couple months before development and the pitch and the back and forth with the licensors to get them to green light it. So it's a problem. There's a reason why most years I only have 1 or 2 books out, because these things just take a while to make. You know,
Right.
It's old world craftsmanship.
Scott, is there any other particular property either within Star Trek that you haven't done yet, or another property that you would love to get your hands on and write about?
Well, with Star Trek, we've been lucky. I mean, almost everything we've wanted to do, we've gotten to do. Everything, all of the the only thing we haven't gotten to do is Enterprise, just because Enterprise never really gets a big comic book focus. And also, they give us the weird ones, which is what I love. You know, when they want to do Star Trek Doctor Who, we got the call. When they want to do Star Trek Planet of the Apes, and that one took forever for them to get going because they couldn't find somebody to have a story idea that both Fox and CBS would go for, and we got to do that one. So I mean, I kind of like being the relief guy who just comes in to do the weird stuff.
That was the first crossover comic I read, and I enjoyed it. The Planet of the Apes.
Oh, thanks.
I enjoyed that. I saw it on the bookshelf. This is a quick story. I saw it on the bookshelf over in the local comic book store. I'm like, seriously, Planet of the Apes and Star Trek. I gotta try this, and I enjoyed that one. I don't know. Did you do the Green Lantern one too as well?
No, I didn't do the Green Lantern one. That one, I think that was Mike Johnson.
Yeah. But I enjoyed that. I give you kudos.
Yeah, the Primate Directive is my favorite title.
Absolutely.
Well, and what was interesting with that is we had so many licensors to deal with. We had CBS, and then we had, and of course we had Fox for Planet of the Apes, and then we also had the Heston estate to deal with. They had
oh boy!
And the only note we got back from the Heston estate was after issue 1 is, can you make his thighs look meatier? Absolutely, we can do that.
Wow.
No problem.
That's a can do.
That's a
Done and done.
Yeah. But with the crossover books, it's like the biggest thing for David and I is, can we find a way that they make sense together? That I believe in both. And if we can't do it, we won't even try. And with Apes, it was tough finding a way to kind of get those two to work together.
Right. And so with the crossovers, do you find as a struggle to like respect both fandoms? Because, you know, Doctor Who, Star Trek, mega followers.
It's the same thing.
Is that hard to like try and respect the canon of both of those shows, trying to make that crossover and to make sense?
That's the biggest thing, is making it make sense for both.
Which version of which, which Doctor and which Enterprise crew or whatever version,
with that kind of gets dictated to us. That like we know coming in that the BBC wants Matt Smith and that CBS wants Next Gen. So that part kind of gets dictated. But in terms of making them work together, Star Trek is science fiction. Doctor Who is more science fantasy. So you kind of have to find a way to make them for it to work clash against each other in a way that the characters kind of realize it, and that's where your conflict is. But it's still true to both. It can be tricky.
So, would you say there's more like creative license given to comics to do in crossovers than like novels?
Well, I think it's more the fact that I think with a novel, I think the way a novel it would be a harder sell for a novel. Put it that way. I think because comics are much more what's the new flashy thing to see, and you can have a flashy cover. You know, with novels, you got people who are working on these things for like months and months and months, and I don't know. As much as I love writing crossover comics, it feels a bit transitory to do it as a novel. I would feel worried about it. I know it's happened before. There was the next gen
X-Men
novels.
Oh yeah, the 2 X-Men one, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
And David, would that be something that you would like to try to do a crossover novel?
Not really.
Not really.
Fair.
That sounds like, to be honest, it sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah.
I've worked on projects where I've had to answer to multiple licensors and multiple editors at once, and I did not like it.
Yeah.
You can only do it if it's properties you love. I mean, I grew up.
Yeah. I mean, if it was, Star Trek and Aliens, that I could figure out. I could make that work. But again, I guess it would depend on the license.
Right.
Well, I mean, Nicholas Meyer famously did it back with it's a kind of a crossover with his Sherlock Holmes novels, where it's Sherlock Holmes and Sigmund Freud. And then I think he did follow up 2 more of those where they're kind of literary crossovers. So it can work, obviously, with novels. It's got to be something that the writer loves.
Right. And dealing with
licenses.
Dealing with the license, is that like a very difficult process, or is that you just have to submit a request?
Well, it's usually in comics, and I'm sure it's the same with David. You have an editor who's kind of helping you out and going between, but it really just depends on the licensing.
Yeah, for the most part, the writers, we're not supposed to have direct contact with the licensor. We are expected to communicate with them through the official channel of our editor. So if where the stories originate, sometimes the writer comes up with it, sometimes the editor comes up with it, sometimes the licensor has an idea for a product they'd like to see put into the market. But the way it always ends up working out is a writer puts together a pitch, the editor says, all right, I dig it, put together an outline, full outline for the project. You write your outline, and once it passes muster with the editor says, all right, let's see what licensing thinks. And it goes to licensing, and licensing can either go approved with no changes, approved with the following changes, or this isn't really working for us. Maybe you want to go in a different direction.
Okay.
And you have to get their buy-in before you proceed to the writing of the full script or manuscript or creation of the product or whatever it is. But in terms of working with licensing, the Star Trek licensing department has been very easy to work with over the last 20 years that I've been writing novels. They're always very knowledgeable. They know the product. They know the continuity, the canon. They have been some of the most ardent fans and enthusiastic champions of the stuff that we've done in the books, like creating original literary series, post-finale books that expand the characters beyond where continuity left them. Licensing has been very supportive, very knowledgeable, and very helpful, which I've heard stories from authors who have worked on other licenses, which I will not name, who I've been told can sometimes be very persnickety and very difficult, very micromanaging. That's not Star Trek. The Star Trek licensing department has never, in my experience, been micromanaging the content of the fiction. They've actually been very supportive and really just a delight to work with.
Cool.
And, in my experience, compared to the licensors from other big media conglomerates, when you get notes back from the CBS for Trek projects, the notes are always about either character or story, and that's what they're concerned about. It's not about, well, I don't like it because X, or I wouldn't have written it that way, or it's always really smart notes that make the story better. It's absolutely a pleasure to work with. And I haven't had as much experience with others, but it's pretty rare to have a license department that is this kind of honed in on what makes the story work and protecting the characters in the right kind of way.
Yeah, they're great.
So I had a question about the licenses. Basically, I was wondering, would there be any chance of like there being like a sort of major, like media event that would cross over using comics and novels and maybe games or something as well? Or would that be an issue to do with licensing? I was remembering back when you had Voyager and there was like the tie-in series of Day of Honor. It was a novel series, but it sort of was a sort of event with the Voyager episode Day of Honor.
Yeah, Day of Honor was one of those special things that started in the novels. I believe it was a concept developed by John Ordover. He was really good at these. He came from the comic book industry. He'd been a comic book editor and a comic book fan for a number of years. So he brought that sensibility of big events, crossover events as a marketing hook. He brought that with him to the novels and started getting them thinking in that direction. There have been a couple of instances where, for instance, the books have tried to coordinate with other licensees. For instance, there was a novel I think put together by Michael A. Martin, The Needs of the Many, which was supposed to bridge the continuity differences between the literary side and the Star Trek Online multiplayer role-playing game. So they tried to do that. As far as overlapping with the comics, it's been rare. John and I actually wrote back in 2001 a Star Trek DS9 TNG post-finale crossover miniseries comic called Divided We Fall, and it connected into the continuity that was being done in the DS9 post-finale novels, which had just begun that sort of shared continuity at that time. But one of the issues is that the turnaround time from story approval, script approval, art on a comic book is shorter than that for a novel. Novels take months to write, months to edit, and then there's usually months of waiting up in the print queue, distribution, warehousing, retail distribution again. As a result, because the time schedules are very different, it can be very difficult to coordinate the release of a comic book, the release of a novel, the release of something like a new adventure module or new adventure expansion in the online game, and then something on TV. Trying to coordinate all of these to happen at the same time, seriously, it was easier to plan the D-Day invasion than it is to
Those are the only instances I can think of with Star Trek. And like Star Wars tried it once where they had their it was in between Empire and Jedi. And they tried to do
the Empire.
And they tried to do a video game and a novel and comics. And just thinking about trying to coordinate that makes my head hurt.
Can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's like I remember some joke by Steve Martin where he was saying, the way to not get frustrated when you're trying to do things is to set small goals. Learn to achieve the small goals and then work up to bigger goals. My next goal is to become the all-being master of time, space, and dimension. After that, I will plan a trip to Europe. So that's what it feels like when you're trying to plan a multimedia event through a licensed property.
Ooh.
Oh my!
Thank you very much, both of you, for coming on today.
It's been a pleasure.
Well, it was a lot of fun. Thank you guys
Yes.
for joining us.
No, thanks for having me. And Scott, I will be in touch. And David, you and I have talked in the past about podcasting as well. It was a while back, so I may reach out, see if there's some chance we can collaborate.
Drop me on.
All right.
Thanks
Thank
a lot,
you.
guys.
Take care, everyone.
Take care. Like and subscribe. The Scotch Trekker.
That's
Thanks, Maria.
No
We'll
problem.
be back. We'll be back next Saturday.
Okay.
So take note of we're on Facebook and on Twitter and stuff like that. And the address is the Scotch Tracker, all one word. But for now, thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.